I would like to take a moment to let everyone know that the Arctic Academic eTalk series, co-hosted with The Watch, Command Magazine, and supported by various commands and partners across the circumpolar north, will be resuming this spring. And now I'm excited to introduce Charlotte Duval-Lantoine to talk about her best-selling book, The Ones We Let Down: Toxic Leadership Culture and Gender Integration in the Canadian Forces, that made it on to the Hill Times Top 100 Books of 2022. I've also been informed that this is a book that the Chief of Defense Staff has read and that the Chief of the Navy has 3 copies of. Charlotte is the Ottawa Operations Manager and a Fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. She obtained her MA in Military History at Queen's University in 2019, and her BA in History and Political Science at McGill University in 2017. In 2022, Charlotte was recognized as a Woman in Defense and Security Emerging Leader for her work during the sexual misconduct crisis plaguing the Canadian military. We ask that you remain muted during Charlotte's presentation. Afterwards, you'll have time for an open Q&A. Standard question etiquette applies. Raise your hand if you would like to pose a question yourself, or you can send your questions via the chat or in a private message to me. And without further ado, Charlotte, the floor is yours. And you're muted.
I will never learn. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me today on this series. Should we start with some questions?
Charlotte, would you like to tell us a little bit about your book for the ones who haven't read it first?
Yeah, of course. Sorry about that. So I started this project in September of 2017 when I was doing my master's degree research. It was quite at it was rather the beginning of Operation Honor, and I was trying to figure out what led us there. And while I was doing my coursework in military history at the same time, I really noticed something that perplexed me in a way, is the fact that we were talking about the Decade of Darkness, which is an era for those of you who don't know about this, an era where the Canadian Armed Forces was experiencing major downsizing and budget cuts, up to about 30% of the CAF's personnel was cut, and about the same percentage of the budget was cut. But at the same time, you had an increased operational tempo with a lot of peacekeeping missions. To name a few, that would be Croatia, the explosion of the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and obviously the most notorious one, Somalia, and the torture to death of Shidane Aron, who was a Somali teenager at the ends of the Canadian Airborne Regiment. But at the same time, in 1989, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordered the CAF to reach full gender integration by 1999. And those stories have never been told at the same time. It's always been as part of silos in the scholarship, and we haven't really had an examination of those two together, because to me, you cannot look at the issues with gender integration, and spoiler alert, the military did not meet the standard established by the tribunal by 1999. In fact, the number of women had increased by less than 1%. And mostly because because more men left the military than women entered. So we were dealing with that kind of dynamic, but also at the quantitative level. In 1998, we had a sexual misconduct crisis. The one that took the size that it had. Sexual misconduct in the military was not really something that people were not aware of, but it took a major size when McLean started reporting on it in May of 1998, and then several subsequent reports on this throughout 1998. So we would make it like the size of the scandal will be very much akin to the one that Canada experienced in 2014 and 2015. Except that there was very limited response from the government and the CAF after that, aside from moving sexual assault investigations to the military justice system, which was the most significant change at the time. So putting those two together, the issue of the decade of darkness, war crimes perpetrated by some Canadian service members. Also, just to note that Somalia was not the only let's call it what it was, a war crime perpetrated by some Canadians. There were also the Bakovici incident, where service members sold equipment to the black market and assaulted a minor who happened to be a patient at the Bakovici hospital. So these organizational and those contexts, I decided to put it back in the story of gender integration and putting gender integration back in the story of the decade of darkness. And from there, what I do is that I am trying to tell a story of what toxic leadership would look like in the Canadian military, just to create awareness, because it is something that we don't really talk about in Canada. It's the topic of toxic military leadership is actually quite popular in the United States, born out of the tensions during the Vietnam War, and also related to the issues of civil and military relations. But we haven't really sat down and looked at it at a Canadian level, aside from saying, yeah, the Canadian Airborne Regiment was toxic. There were instances of toxic leaders in the military, but organizational and institutional toxicity does not really exist in Canada. We're better than this. And it's not the case. When you look at the typology and the history of the Canadian military during the 1990s, and looking at that theory that came out from the United States and the Canadian doctrine, you see that toxicity existed in the military at that time. And so I go from there and explain why culture changed, because gender integration was supposed to be a culture change, why that culture change did not happen, not only in terms of the failures at the organizational level, but also in terms of toxicity and how it impacted service members, but also what it means for culture change in the future in the CAF, because I finished my book. Actually, I received the peer review of my book after the 2021 scandal came up and started really. And so that's what I was trying to balance in all of this, because by 2019, when I was finishing what will become this manuscript, I had an understanding that something like this would happen again, another scandal, and the fact that we haven't really learned the lessons of that time fully. And so incorporating those stories from the 21st century to me was very important, so that we kind of try and learn what led us to 2021.
Okay, well, I'm going to take my prerogative as the moderator and ask Charlotte my first question. So you mentioned the lack of leadership buy-in as a cause for continued problems in relation to culture and integration. Why do you think this is the case, and what can be done to increase this buy-in rate?
So the dynamics behind leadership buy-in is quite complex, and I've done study. I'm doing a study that is kind of changing my approach to what buy-in means and how it operates. But basically, in the 1990s, the buy-in was that the lack of buy-in was that leaders at a high level did not think that it was really their responsibility to really pursue that change. There was constant monitoring, giving recommendations to the Canadian Armed Forces, and nothing was being implemented. And all the responsibilities for gender integration were delved down to commanding officers, and at NDHQ, in terms of pursuing policies, it was the responsibility of a lieutenant colonel. So that's really low down the chain of command, and that creates problems in terms of like how those policy reaches people. But I think it came from the inability to understand that equal treatment doesn't mean treating people exactly the same. And social historian Paul Jackson has a very interesting sentence to really explain why equal treatment is not really a useful approach to things. He says, well, treating people the same would be giving an elephant and a mouse a piece of cheese. The mouse will flourish, but the elephant would starve. And that's kind of the approach that the military took at that time, was like, well, if we do things differently for women, it's unequal treatment, and therefore we cannot go about it. But they were trying to give a piece of cheese to like a cheetah and an elephant and a mouse and a cat, and not really trying to understand that there were differences that needed to be taken into account to really pursue their policies. Today, I would say since 2021, we're seeing, things have evolved, right? Like, we're talking about something that has spanned over my lifetime, and have preceded my lifetime too. And so there was a gain of awareness that differential treatment doesn't mean preferential treatment, or thwarting the principle of meritocracy, right? We can have arguments about how meritocracy works and how maybe it's not that much of a meritocracy, but that would be a philosophical question. So there was a gain of awareness. The problem that we're seeing now is that it's not the lack of buy-in. I think that the military is very much aware that culture needs to change. Where the lack of buy-in relies, like where the buy-in becomes qualified and not as strong as I would like it to see, would be that it seems to me that at the institutional level, I'm talking at the institutional level for those of you serving, I am not saying that individual leaders lack the buy-in, because that is a very individual question and I cannot impose people's thoughts and willingness and intentions onto them. But at the organizational level, I'm seeing things that where it's like there is buy-in, but there is lack of buy-in for the proper approach. And the rewriting of doctrines and the focus on individual professional conduct and character-based leadership, to me, is lacking the understanding, is showing a lack of understanding that it goes beyond an individual. There are psychosocial dynamics that are shaped by policies and the organization and the personnel management system and who gets to be valued in the military that goes way beyond an individual behavior, in the sense of like someone deliberately trying to be more inclusive. There are barriers to all of that the military is not effectively talking about today, that makes me wonder how sustainable that buy-in is going to be, as we're going to see a change of leadership in the coming months as the new GoFo plot is coming forward. How do you get that new buy-in? It's something that keeps me up at night, honestly. It's how do we talk to service members? How do we talk about those complex dynamics and do it in a way that makes sense for them, but also that they can implement? And the problem that we're facing today, on top of those issues, is that we're dealing with a military with a lot of missions that keep on expanding, and threats that are coming at the forefront. We saw it over the past few weeks with unidentified flying objects over North American airspace. We're seeing that with the war in Ukraine. We're seeing that with domestic operations, but they are over 10,000 people short. They do not have the proper equipment. And this is where the idea that the decade of darkness has not been completely resolved from the military, because we're still catching up with those budget cuts to this day, over 30 years later. And so service members do not necessarily have the time to deal with something as complex as culture change. And also, like, the problem is that lack of equipment, that heightened operational tempo, if you allow me to be a little bit jargony, means that not only do they not have the time to actively pursue culture change, but they might not have the mental space to do all of this, and burnout and lack of institutional support in terms of workplace well-being contributes to toxicity and workplace issues. And this is part of what I'm talking about in my book.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for that very well thought out answer. I think you've introduced your topic in a way that really shows the urgency and how we need to pay more attention to this important issue. If you have questions for Charlotte, you can raise your hand or you can send it in a private message. Okay.
Hi, Nicole. I think one of the problems is I'm not sure if there's a raise hand first. Okay, I'm gonna raise my hand.
Go ahead.
So thanks, Andrea Sharon from the University of Manitoba, and thanks very much, Charlotte, for this book. I was wondering though, if you could give us perhaps some of the good news stories that is coming out as a result of the CAF recognizing that there's work to be done. And one cannot deny that certainly the CAF has put a lot of resources and has tried to think through how one can change culture. I mean, that is the sort of mountain that many organizations have to climb, and it's really not easy. So are there any indications that things are moving in a more positive direction?
Absolutely. So this is the thing, right? This is why I'm not saying to this day that what is happening today is the 1990s all over again. Like, there are parallels, but one thing to start is the fact that the military has now an L1 to deal with this. You're going from a lieutenant colonel dealing with those issues to a lieutenant general that sits on the Armed Forces Council, which means that they're sitting at the table with the chief of the defense staff, the chief of all the services so they're taking part in these conversations. And that person, Lieutenant General Jenny Carignan, is equivalent to those chiefs. And I find it very important to make sure that those issues still have the same visibility. Then the efforts for consultation, there is still that question of whether or not they're going to translate into policies, because that takes time. But the fact that there are conversations everywhere in Canada led by the Chief Professional Conduct and Culture is very encouraging. The fact that I have meetings with the Chief of the Defense Staff, the Minister of National Defense, and CPCC over those issues is very encouraging, and shows me that there is awareness and understanding of the urgency of all of that. And another thing that I will mention is that there is a push at the political level, which is unprecedented in the history of sexual misconduct in the military. The last time we saw a Minister of National Defense being very involved in the matters of culture change in the Canadian Armed Forces was the 1990s. So it started when I wasn't even born. So we're seeing that push. The thing is, And something that I've noticed in my book and that we're seeing with other initiatives at the Canadian Armed Forces is the fact that there are posting cycles. And now the question is, will this sustain not only the posting cycle, because we're going to have a Gulf plot very soon, and is that attention going to stay? Who is, if Lieutenant General Jenny Carignan is changing roles, are we going to have another L1 that's going to be as motivated and as forward in all those issues? And so there is something encouraging. I think that the time is up to optimism, but the task is so big that now the question is, will it have tangible effects down the line?
Thank you so much for that question and a wonderful response. Nancy, you're next.
Hi, it's Nancy and I are sharing her laptop.
A few of us here.
Oh, hi.
Lieutenant Colonel Pat Newman, Canadian Army.
Nice to meet you.
And I apologize in advance. I have not had the opportunity to read your book yet. You talk about institution and ultimately culture, personnel, leadership, all stuff that's heavily interrelated. How do you define an institution separate from those other things, as in like a dependent or independent variable that you need to analyze in order to see what the change is?
So the thing is that I do not see things as dependent or independent variables because I'm a historian. And so the methodology that I'm using is very different. But the complexity with institution is that I don't think that you can really separate them from the people that are in there. So what my approach was more looking at it as from the NDHQ standpoint and seeing where the convergence, I am losing my English, but like where it linked up with other units and other divisions and other, obviously institutions going to change, the definition's going to change depending on whether you look at a unit, a division, and all that kind of stuff. But when I talk about the institutional level is how policies and formal practices, and this is very important, formal practices are going to shape people's behavior. And then so the chain of command, the laws and the regulations, so not only the National Defense Act, but also all the DAODs are at the time, so the Defense Administrative Orders and directives, but at the time the Canadian Forces Administrative Orders are aimed at changing shaping people's behavior. So that's what I'm at the national level. So coming from NDHQ and delving down the rest of the Canadian Armed Forces to the chief of the defense staff, to the most junior private that entered the military. So does that answer your question? Like, this is how I approach those questions.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Adam?
Hi, Charlotte. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep. Hi,
Great.
Adam.
Hi, nice to see you again. Thanks so much for the presentation and making yourself available to talk about this really important issue. I was wondering, you mentioned it a little bit, talking about kind of the simultaneity of pressures that the military is facing inside and out in terms of operations and recruitment, retention, culture change. I'm wondering where you see the triangulation of effort in terms of really like strategic purpose for the organization in terms of culture change. This term we're hearing a lot about called reconstitution that General Eyre has become very big on. And then this ongoing defense review, which unlike the process that led up to Strong, Secure, Engage, seems to be far less visible, at least to the wider public. There's not a lot of political posturing about it. So what's your sense about how or if those three things are kind of related? And do you have any ideas about how culture change may be woven into this defense policy review update? And in particular, I'm wondering about your thought about the organization talks about reconstitution a lot, but I'm not seeing what that means, because it doesn't seem like they're taking the gas off of anything. There doesn't seem to be kind of a okay, we're going to have to turn down certain things and really focus on rebuilding this capacity or that. So I'm wondering kind of what's your views on that? Is that possible? Can the organization really reform in this fundamental way while trying to do all of these demands that are being placed on it at the same time as well?
So I told the chief of the defense staff about a month and a half ago that I do not think that they will be able to do everything that they want to do with reconstitution and culture change if they keep the current operational tempo. And this is a political decision that needs to come from cabinet, and that is a complex one. And unfortunately, this is a political question. I do believe that culture change and reconstitution should be more or less one and the same, to be honest with you, because culture change will go hand in hand with a personnel management overhaul. I do not think that we can change the Canadian Forces culture without changing the way that the personnel system functions. Because it goes down to who gets to be valued. And we have very much focused on the fact that it's a white male heterosexual institution, but there are still qualifiers in all of that depending on someone's occupation. And someone's occupation is going to determine how they get valued in the institution, whether they can make it to the GOVO level, who gets to be sidelined so that others can go up the ladder. And also who gets to be satisfied in their job and do the best they can without feeling burnt out because they have lost a sense of purpose. These are big questions that reconstitution, at least from and the retention strategy, because we need to understand that reconstitution is just one directive, and it includes itself in a bunch of other strategies that have come out or are coming out. The retention strategy, and I don't know if it's out yet, the HR strategy, that to me, they're interconnected and they cannot be seen as separate efforts. Because from my standpoint, as someone that deals with issues of conduct and personnel, operating in my day-to-day job is working with David Perry, who is a procurement expert. I see parallels in the issues that we're dealing with. It's information management, it's personnel issues, it's capabilities and the amount of resources that we want the military to have, and also how much room do we give the military to focus on change, and those are interconnected, and we still haven't had really those conversations. So this is one of my worries at the political level, that we are not making those connections, especially operational tempo, and taking the time to do all those reforms, which might lead also to under-resourcing, both in terms of people and in terms of equipment, time, resources, and other types of resources. And then finally, I would say that it might be controversial of an idea, but I really do believe in it. It's maybe putting on hold the SSC targets of having 100,000 service members. Start with trying to find the people that you need for what you need to do right now. And it might be that 100,000 people, but just try to focus on getting back the bare minimum that you've lost since the pandemic, and then go from there. Because the problem is that when you're bleeding so many people, especially at the middle, and this is the big problem, it's like, it's not cadets that the military is missing the most. It's actually people that are major lieutenant colonel or colonels or the Navy equivalents, and that becomes a problem. And finally, to bring in the issue with the defense policy update, the military still struggles from a lack of transparency, which leads to issues of accountability. And I'm very concerned with the fact that we don't know to what extent the external monitor will be able to really speak out publicly and deliver reports that are going to be public. And we know very little about the progress over time of all of this. I understand that it's difficult, that there are issues of information management and stakeholder engagement that require a lot of time. But as someone from the outside, I would be keen to have more communication. But once again, that is a culture change in and of itself, encouraging the military to actually talk about those issues, show more transparency, admitting mistakes when they are made. There has been some movement more towards that, especially, well, people can agree with that change of policy or not, but we have seen it after Major General Fortin showed up to court in his uniform and all his medals. People have spoken out against it, and then the military changed the policy with a Can 4 Gen, which there is a question of how formalized this policy change is, but we're seeing some movement into like more back and forth, but that back and forth remains very, very limited, and the military would, the handicap is justifying it through a problem of time, time being of the essence, but we're going to reach a year since the DPU has been called and outlining the budget, and we still haven't heard any real timeline on it going out. So I hope that answers your question, because it could be a PhD dissertation of its own, and I'm just trying to kind of like give you pathways on how I think about this.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, I really appreciate the feedback.
Thanks.
I'm sorry, I'm going to pronounce your name wrong. Aditi?
Hi, Nicole. You actually pronounced it quite well.
Hi.
Hi, Charlotte. Thank you so much. Like I've told you 100 times, it's a great book. And I'll repeat it again, like really intriguing subject. And I know the kind of work you've done on it. So congratulations for that. And my question is related to, the factor of generation gap. Like how relevant do you think is the factor of generation gap when it comes to the subject of culture change? When we talk about socializing CAF members into a more inclusive culture, do you feel that different generations of officers and NCOs require different messaging? And do you think that is being done well at this stage?
Yes and no. So yes, to your first question, I do think that there's going to be generational gap, especially, but not only in terms of generation, but we're also going to talk about NCMs versus officers. We're going to talk about, okay, let me start over. The messaging is the same, and not taking into account the different subcultures that exist within the military. Mm-hmm. So not only like, obviously there is an overarching culture that is shaped by the institution and all of those formal policies, but then you're going to see different approach to how things work and how to be an effective soldier based on whether you're Army, Navy, Air Force. I was about to forget what Air Force is called. Fantastic. And then like you're also talking about CJOC and the special forces that have, and then you delve down all of that. You have the different divisions, and then you have the different brigades, and then you have the different units. All of them are gonna have their own culture. And because of the posting cycle, those dynamics and those cultures are always evolving. So obviously you're dealing with a baseline, which is where you get your basic message, but then you're dealing with all of this. And then what do you deal with? Non-commissioned members and officers. Since 1998, 1996, all officers are required to have a bachelor's degree. So you're dealing with a university educated force here. NCMs, some of them do not even have a high school diploma. Then you're dealing with the fact that some of them come from different province. They come from rural background. They come from conservative circumscriptions. And all of that need to be taken into account. And I do think that the problem is that we focus a little bit too much on the messaging. And the problem is that the CAF is dealing with not only like that, the multitude of cultures and understanding of things from, well, 70,000 people, because you also need to take into account reservists that are mostly from urban centers. So you're dealing with that mess essentially it's like you have different grains of rice and you have a giant bag. Try to like message properly to each and every single one of them. And then you're also dealing with the fact that the military is very much aware that its internal communications will make it out one day. So they also are trying to find a messaging that is palatable to civilians. And so you find yourself in that constant tension that is extremely difficult to be done. And as you said, then you have a generational gap where you have younger folks, especially Gen Zers, that are way more attuned to the ideas of social justice. Mind you, this is not true across the board, which adds another complexity, is that you have people that are more leftist and you have people that are more conservative. And sometimes there is, especially with polarization, you're dealing with something even more difficult than we might have had in the 1990s, for example. And so you have to deal with all of that. And honestly, it's also, as someone that thinks about those issues and sitting down, I'm also thinking about my own messaging when I talk to the military, because there are some terms that on both sides of the aisles are gonna raise eyebrows and might make resistance more likely, especially when you're dealing with wokeness, which is pretty much every time you say that people need to have like the same access to opportunities, and we need to understand that some of those issues are systemic and not just individuals. Well, people tend to see that as a sign on a slight on their morality. And so how do you avoid that pushback so that you can move forward? And then you have the added complexity of socialization and the effect on people. I would like to say that the brainwashing discourse that we have around socialization, I think is a little bit too extreme, because you've seen it, like growing up. I'm pretty sure that all of you are have gone in different directions than your parents wanted. Like you're not just like, for some people it's the case, but some of you would have cleared your own path in some ways. And I'm seeing that in my own upbringing, that I've decided to go a very different route to what I was raised. But obviously policies are going to shape how you behave, and then you have those informal dynamics that are going to shape how people react to message and how people react to policies and how they pursue them. So the communication piece is one that is massive, and it would take a sitting down of the over 900 PEOs to really sit down and think about it and do, I don't know how many surveys to figure this out. And that's one of the pieces that is like that tight knot with so many strings that would take a long time to figure out. But perfect is the enemy of the good. And so I think that even if the semantics used or the ideas, the words, the concepts are not the perfect ones, because us scholars tend to focus on that, like having the perfect term. As long as it has the intended effect, I'm honestly all for it.
Thank you so much. That was like quite a detailed and nuanced perspective. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank you, Aditi.
Charlotte, you end your book by mentioning how the era of darkness has continued into the 2020s. Can you speak more on this? You've touched about how this light is already starting to peek through a bit and how we're starting to see advancement, but how has this era of darkness continued?
So I know that my book like finishes on a very bleak note by saying like it's not over. I would say we're like in a very, very foggy tunnel. There's light, but it's hard to see. And some of the things that I touch on is the fact that the military is short of people with too many operations to count, and is lacking the proper equipment. You are dealing with folks that are living in serious poverty because there has not been any adjustment in terms of their cost of living or support from the military on that. We are dealing with the after effects still of Afghanistan and what it meant for people dealing with PTSD and all of this. So I do think that the decade of darkness is continuing because we are not only seeing some similar circumstances today, but I also think it's because we have not come out of the woods yet in terms of catching up on all the issues that came out of the 1990s, and equipment and the procurement system would be one of the biggest ones I would mention. It's because we had so little capital projects for so long that now we need to purchase everything at the same time. And the fact that we need to do so many things with so little people. And that creates issues. Like we cannot expect of our service members not to feel strained by all of this and everything being kumbaya. We know that when resources are tight, when you are in constant working mode and you cannot and you never see the results that you're expecting to see, we know that those create dynamics where personal misconduct becomes more likely. And it can be innocuous for some people. It's just like yelling at your coworker, right? But like that dissatisfaction and that hardship can cause those issues. And there are actually some studies, not in the military, but out of the sorry, it's gonna get heavy, so trigger warning for people, but I'm gonna talk about pedophilia for a little bit. But there are signs that some people who commit pedophilia, it happens at a time where their life is very chaotic and they're trying to regain control. And they see something more vulnerable than them, and some assaults end up becoming a question of trying to gain some kind of control over their life. And so we can only expect that when things get chaotic for everyone in the military, those tensions start to happen. Not because service members are bad people, it's because they're good people with a lot of strain. And sometimes you cannot expect everything from everyone.
Okay, good answer. Carlene, you're next.
Hi, that was interesting what you just said. Anyway, I'm still processing that. I've been reading in the like kind of leadership literature lately, and I was interested because you started off talking about toxic leadership, and and then you're just talking about what kind of messaging is used, in general. But I was wondering, like, are people thinking of what kind of leadership is necessary to actually maybe be better at working on these kinds of issues? Are people using language around that piece?
So yeah, there has been quite a change of the idea of leadership. So not only interested to serve, but there are talks about not only inclusive leadership, so a type of leadership that takes into account all of those intersectional dynamics and make sure that everyone gets to feel like they're valued members of their own units. But there's also the idea of compassionate leadership that has come out of Canadian Forces College paper. And I know that the person who's written it is working at the Canadian Defense Academy currently, trying to expand on that and trying to develop some professional development content about this. And compassionate leadership comes from the idea that it's about recognizing that your experience as a leader is not necessarily what your service members will experience. And so listening to them and trying to understand where your team members are coming from when they are frustrated, but also trying to notice before some service members like feel comfortable enough to talk to you. Try to notice what is going on, validating your members' feelings, all those ideas. And in 2020, in the spring of 2022, also the military put out directives for diverse and inclusive behavior that went really to the nitty-gritty to how those can look. It was literally a list of like what to do in some context. And then there is a reconsideration of how to approach ethics and how ethics, defense ethics, are operating in a unit at peacetime. So those are some of the things that are happening and that are actually very encouraging, because they actually providing tangible ideas on what needs to get done. But my approach to toxic leadership is also to outline what ineffective leadership will look like, because there's a lack of conversation around what not to do as well. And so that striking that balance is kind of nice, but I gotta say that those recent directives, I find them very positive and very good. Now, it's like that agency piece that remains to be solved. It's like, okay, we've written them. How do we get people to do it? And that gets a little bit more complicated.
Thank you.
Chris, if you'd like to pose your question.
Yeah, hi there. Hopefully y'all can hear me.
Yes. Hi, Chris.
Yeah, so I'm a product of the decade of darkness. I lived through that period of time. I'm retired now. And Charlotte's book really resonated with me on quite a few levels. So I really appreciate her writing it and bringing all of those things to everybody. So thank you, Charlotte. My question is, how do you propose that we build an institutional personnel management system that would endure, that would have the foresight and the capacity to deal with long-term personnel issues that we can't deal with today? For instance, the evidence shows that FRP was not well thought out. The evidence shows on many trades that we're out of cycle with recruiting. We can't, we have big dips in personnel, and then we try to recruit personnel quickly, and we can't do it because of the timeframes involved. We're always out of cycle, and we don't have a long enough term view of our personnel management systems. How would you propose we deal with that?
Ooh, you are not throwing me a softball here, Chris, but I really appreciate this question. So I don't have a clear solution outlined for you, unfortunately, but I think that the principles that I'm gonna outline to you is, I think, what we should start with. So I've written a paper for CGEI last spring about the personal piece of the defense policy update that we should consider. And I think that we really need to try and think a little bit better on the evolving missions of the military, its current capabilities and equipment, and where personnel fits in it. And I think that there needs to be better communication at the DHQ, MilParsCom level, with the services down to the individual units to try and create a more holistic approach to personnel management. There's another thing is that we need to recognize that sometimes military service is going to be frustrating. Because you cannot always go where you want to. That's the reality of life, and the concept of unlimited liability and universality of service will create those tensions because you cannot always get what you want, and that can strain the willingness of someone to serve. So how do you deal with that? And the current, so we go into questions of wellness and well-being in the workplace. And while the military is emphasizing important aspects of building resiliency, I do think that there should be a little bit more support and services around all of that. Does that mean that at some point we need to have a system in the military that kind of holds people's hands? That gets a little bit more murky and complicated, because like, are we willing to have those conversations and willing to spend that much money into personnel issues? The reality is that at the political level, we don't really want to do that at this stage. But in essence, it's kind of like the procurement system. We need a more agile approach because things change all the time, and currently the personnel management issue is not agile enough. And giving more flexibility to commanding officers and career managers will not necessarily help with all of that. So we find ourselves with something very complex that will require actually a lot of taking it from low-hanging fruits. I would say, and I think that the piece for that is actually monitoring. And I know I've been like the most annoying person about this, because every time I get into a defense consultation, that's the question I ask. How are you gonna monitor all of that? How are you gonna deal with the unintended consequences? But that is the thing, is that to have a more agile military at every level, having monitoring that assesses the effects of those policies, and understanding, like I was saying to Titi, is the fact that we're dealing with so many subcultures and different types of people, but we're dealing with very homogeneous approaches to them. Understanding where the unintended consequences are, a cost-benefit analysis of all of that, and understanding that the needs of the organization are also the needs of their of its people, and sometimes they can stand in contrast, but how do you resolve that? How do you make it less hard for service members? I think is a question that we need to have over and over again, while taking into account that those obligations are here, and that if we get rid of universality of service, for example, we are gonna land with very serious fairness issues. And those are very visible in the American system, because Americans do not have the universality of service. And there has been discussions down south to have it, to push it forward, but and to implement it as part of the legislation. But that creates problems too. So how do you deal with all of this is I think should be at the center of the personnel management and putting agility. Problem is that it would involve taking a lot of risks. And right now, internally, that risk-taking is not part of the Canadian Armed Forces DNA.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much for these absolutely amazing questions, and Charlotte for providing so much insight, knowledge, and expertise on this subject matter. Are there any upcoming projects, research, possible books that you're working on now that you would like to share with us?
I'm doing too much, and Chris has actually told me to calm down, but I haven't listened. I'm sorry, Chris. So I'm doing a couple of stuff. So currently it's gonna come out in the spring. I'm editing an issue of the Journal of Military and Strategic Studies looking at women's contribution to the military. But I'm also writing my own articles on it, my own article in it, which I'm kind of putting the woman piece not aside, because I do talk about women, but I'm looking at the integration of LGBTQ people. And I do think that it's a missing piece in my book, and I wanted to close that gap. And actually, most of the data that we have is on gay service women, thanks to the work of Karen Puna and Lynn Goudiquet. Then I'm doing a couple of projects on civilian military relations. Ivana, I work with Ivana, who is in the chat, and Jean-Christophe Boucher and Steve Seidman on a public opinion poll looking at whether or not the diversity scandals have shaped people's perception of the military and their willingness to join, and their view of the military as an effective force. And I'm also going to be writing a chapter in an edited volume about the civilian military implications of the past 30 years of sexual misconduct scandals. My approach, I think, is going to call it the tale of two civ mills, looking at the reactions of the Ministry of National Defense to Somalia, in contrast to the past 30 years of sexual misconduct scandals. Kind of try to identify not necessarily why those differences happened, but what was done in reaction to those. It's going to be a very historical approach to a political science book. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic that I'm going to find myself in. And then I have several ideas for a future book, but as I told Chris, I might be focusing on the low-hanging fruits and look at Somalia. What have we learned? What did we not learn? How we pursued the right culture change, and what can we learn from Somalia that could help the Canadian Armed Forces moving forward?
You definitely have a lot on your plate, and I'm excited to see your upcoming research come out.
Oh, thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you, Charlotte, and everyone for attending today. If you are interested in attending future NAADSN events, we have our mailing list on the NAADSN website. And thank you, Ryan, for all your help making this event possible. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you again. See you all soon.